Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see so many new faces here at Trinity Spiritual Center. I'm Mark Grayson, and I am the director of the center and responsible for all this chaos tonight. But I hope it will be enjoyable. I am excited about our guest tonight because it is actually, this conversation tonight is a continuation of a couple conversations that we've had previously, not only with Micheal, but also with a couple other speakers way back in the dawn of this organization's existence. Probably the third conversation that we had was with Ashton Applewhite, and Ashton is an anti-ageism advocate. She started an organization called This Chair Rocks, and we had then the first sort of opportunity to look at the need to bridge the generations and build an understanding across generations, since we all suffer from ageism no matter how old we are. And then later, we had the opportunity to have a dinner like this last May with Micheal. The topic of that conversation was death. And while many people thought that it was insane for us to get together and talk about death, we ended up having one of the most memorable evenings that I know I've had in a long time. So thank you, Micheal, for that. And then last November, we had a conversation with Niobe Way, whose book Deep Secrets has been a must-read in education for a long time. She's been studying the global crisis of connection that's gone on with a particular lens at how it takes shape in young men and young women's lives during middle school. And that book, Deep Secrets, has serendipitously been the inspiration for a movie which was just last week nominated for an Oscar. The movie Close is now in theaters, and I highly recommend you go out and see that. So tonight, we're going to try to weave together this intergenerational conversation that we started with Ashton and Micheal, and bring into the middle of that the concept of relationships, friendships, and love. And we could not be in better hands than Micheal Hebb. As some of you who were with us last spring know, he has a reputation for being a provocateur as well as a restaurateur. His great gift is figuring out that the dinner table could be a fulcrum for cultural change, and that it all starts here and now with what we're going to do tonight, which is have a conversation about the many different forms of love that we experience in our lives and how it shapes us. So Micheal has all kinds of accolades, books. You can Google him and figure that out. We're very lucky to have him. And welcome, Micheal.
Oh, thank you.
So I think probably the best place for us to begin is to hear about your latest movement that you've started, and kind of what gave birth to this idea, and fill us in on what sort of your goals and objectives for the movement is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me back. I'll just say that tonight is a little bit like the dessert course for the hard work many of you did last year. Like, you went right up to this idea of our mortality and spent a night sitting in its lap. And that is admirable, and it has ripples, I've heard, throughout the community and our lives. And we learned from that event, or at least I think people learned from that event, that when you turn and face the fact that, yeah, we're not going to be here forever, we actually get more life and we get more vitality when we face those things that we often repress. But tonight we get to talk about love. Like the hard work is done, but that doesn't mean, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why love and why this conversation, but still prepare yourself. I want you to like reach in deep and talk about things that still might make you a little bit uncomfortable, because that's where we get free. That's where we help other people get free or get an enlarged sense of freedom and vitality. But tonight we're doing a Generations Over Dinner experience, and there is some generational diversity in this room. I'm seeing a pretty sizable age span, and not necessarily at every table, but that's okay, because we design these conversations to be perennial conversations that it doesn't matter how old you are. You could be young at heart, old at heart, and they work. But the idea for Generations Over Dinner, which has now become another global movement like Death Over Dinner, still in its infancy, but is really inspired by the fact that we're not a culture that embraces age diversity. We are a culture that is deeply ageist. And we also internalize this whole idea of internalized ageism, how we think about ageism and how we think about, if we think negatively about aging, it's more likely that when we age is going to manifest negatively. Right? But if we actually think about aging, like a friend of mine, Donna Griffin, says, old is gold. If we think about aging as this beautiful thing, this gift, we have a tendency to age better, healthier, live longer, with more of our faculties intact. And that's scientifically proven. Becca Levy has some amazing work on this. But nonetheless, so we have a problem in our culture of ageism. We also have a problem that the young and the old aren't speaking to each other. Obviously, we know this in the United States, and we've exported it around the world, this idea of separating people as they age, and as people, people that are younger and people older are not spending time connecting. And I think that's one of the root causes of so many problems we face. And so we put out this challenge. We said, let's do, Death Over Dinner, it was kind of like this Everest idea. Will people talk about death? They will, it turns out. Over 1 million so far, stop counting. But can we get people to turn and say, how age diverse is my life? Do I know people that are 50 years older than me, younger than me? Do I know people that are 10, 20? And am I getting into really meaningful conversation with them? Because there's so many gifts that the young can give the old and the old can give the young. And it's funny, I told my mom about Generations Over Dinner, and she was like, that's great, finally. And I said, what do you mean, Mom? She says, well, so you're finally gonna, I get to share my wisdom with you. Or, you get to give me the microphone. And I was like, well, yes, but here's the thing, Mom. Like, to be heard as an elder these days, you also have to be willing to listen to the youngers, right? That's kind of an essential part of this new elder. And she had a very succinct answer. She said, not for me. Not about it. It's like, she's always been my hardest critic. But we can talk more about it, but the idea is, let's get as many generations together as possible. Let's engage in really deep conversation. There's a lot of hopelessness and despair that's happening in the youth right now. There's a lot of loneliness in the youth and the folks. I think 70% of people over 80 and 70% of Gen Z are suffering from loneliness. Those that are older know how to cope with it, right? They've learned how to cope. They've learned resilience. Those that are younger, they don't know how to cope with it. Suicidality is at an all-time high, right? Mental well-being is an all-time low. And that's just one reason why we need to connect, because that resilience actually comes. We found the most successful way to build resilience is to take an older person who's not a parent and connect them with a younger person and build a relationship of trust. So this is some of the reasons why we're doing it. And there's, I'll just tell you one exciting thing. It's happening in a lot of exciting places, but one of my partners in crime, Kate, is here. we just pulled off this big feat on MLK Day, was the National Day of Service for AmeriCorps. I said, how can we partner with Generations Over Dinner? And I said, well, let's create a land bridge between young activists and engaged younger folks and senior living. And so there were over 100 senior living locations that hosted AmeriCorps fellows and other young activists to have a conversation about the importance of being in service. And now there's over 1,000 locations that have asked for the same programming, which will become 10,000, which will become 100,000. And that, for me, I think of senior living in a different way than most people. I think it is the place that is the highest concentration of wisdom of any institution on the planet. Right? That's not how we typically think of it, but anyway.
So it sounds like you've been having a lot of dinners and lunches recently.
I have. I was at this amazing lunch for Generations Over Lunch, and this is just kind of the magic that happens at these tables when you bring together generations. There was a young feminist sitting next to me. She was 30. And these two women in there, there was one 80, and there was one that was 100. And just sharp as a tack at 100. And they started talking about basketball, and these two women were saying, like, when we played basketball, they only gave us half the court, for starters, because they thought we'd faint. Like, right, so we only had half the court, and the other thing is, we could only dribble once, and then we had to pass or shoot, because they didn't think we could actually dribble. Right? And, and to see this 30-year-old feminist taking in the reality of what these women lived through, and their attitude about it wasn't bitter, right? It wasn't like, yeah, still more changes need to be made. And I could just see it like sifting into the consciousness of this 30-year-old and giving her a whole different sense of history and perspective and resolve, quite frankly. But sorry,
No.
I'm just
curious, though. No, I'm just curious. I mean, are there enough dinners at this point so that you're beginning to see a pattern or some themes that are recurrent? Because you read a whole book after the death over dinner phenomenon of all the things that people said, and I'm just wondering whether there's some early kind of lessons or findings that jump out.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of them is that we carry a lot of stereotypes. Both the old and the young carry stereotypes of each other, right? We think of Gen Z or the kids these days are just on their phones, not interested in the world, not empathic, a lot of things like that we project on them. And the older folks
are shrinking.
Might not be as radical or like excited about change, or might not have like kind of spicier senses of humor or things like that. Like you think about what is my understanding of the older generations, and to watch those dissolve, which will impact the way people respond to and treat other people in their life. You just need a few examples to counter a stereotype to have it blow apart, right? And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that that's already happening, and I think it's really important. I mean, tonight we're going to talk about love, and we're also going to talk about falling in love and falling out of love. And so those are some of the questions. There's a table captain has these questions in an envelope. It's almost like the Oscars. And I encourage you, even if there is, and especially if there is age diversity at your table, be honest, right? Talk honestly about falling in love, having your heart broken, what you learned. That will be really instructive. People, as they're younger, they don't get a lot of great information about love, right? Love right now is dating apps. Love right now is what I read, what my friends talk about, but there isn't intergenerational conversations about love happening at scale. So that's what's in our near future.
Well, and another intergenerational conversation that I think is one that we need to have, and I picked it up in one of the videos that you sent my way before getting together tonight, but at the Stanford Center for longevity, you had that panel, and that whole conversation about the importance of really knowing your family history. I think it would be a mistake not to at least surface that before we dive into dinner, because this is a community in which families really do still exist and are pretty, important to each other. But I'm not sure that we know all the history that we need to.
Yeah, so in some ways, Generations Over Dinner is just a Trojan horse for this bit of research that Bruce Feiler brought into my life. I don't know if you know the writer Bruce Feiler. He's a guy that every single book he writes becomes a New York Times bestseller. I don't know how that happens. I don't know what kind of fountain he's drinking from, but it's pretty remarkable. And the reason why is he takes his topics so seriously and he researches them so deeply. He walked the Bible. He walked all the pathways of the Bible that are written about, and actually created a PBS series about it as one thing. And then he just wrote an incredible book called Life is in the Transitions, which is how to deal with unexpected things happening to you, which should be required reading for all of us. But his earlier book, The Secrets of Healthy Families, brought up this research that found that one of the key indicators for well-being, especially later in life, is that if people know their family history, right? Now that's a strange thing. It would be like, I don't smoke and I exercise. No, knowing your family history as a key indicator for longevity and also wellness, what is that about, right? So I pushed on it hard with Bruce because I was like, I want to understand what that's made of, because that seems like something that we all can do and we all should do. And there's a little bit of the, maybe not obvious, but the fact that families that tell each other their family history, there's probably less adverse childhood experiences in that family. So the ACE study of adverse childhood experiences is the largest public health study of all time, and we know that traumatic experiences in childhood lead to addiction, obesity, and a variety of disease. Like, we know that, right? So a family that talks to each other, not that it doesn't have adverse experiences or traumatic experience, probably less likely. So you've got that going for you. But the thing that I think is more interesting is this thing called an oscillating narrative, right? So when you know your family's history, you know things are great, and then they get bad, and then they get good, and then they get not so good, and then they get awful, and you understand, right? Because that's in every one of we're made up of a lineage of survivors, right? People who had embodied this idea of an oscillating narrative. And to be able to understand that is a great antidote to despair and hopelessness. Like, people think that this is the first apocalypse we've ever faced, right? And it's not. Like, the world is always ending. I don't know, that's a big like feature of the world, right? It spins, it's sunny and then it's cloudy, and it's always ending, right? There's always been something catastrophic happening. I watched the Challenger blow up on TV. Many of you did too, right? I used to have to get under my desk because of the fear of Soviet raids, right? Yes, there is terrible things happening right now, but the youth doesn't know that this is actually relatively normal, that there is a catastrophe. They don't understand that, and so going into despair and hopelessness is complete. It makes sense. So one of the key ways of getting beyond that is knowing family history, which is what we get to play with tonight, right? Part of your family history is who did you fall in love with? How did you fall in love with them? What's your defining love story? Who broke your heart? What did you learn about yourself from that? How has love changed your idea of it as you age? And then I'm going to give you, there's a spoiler alert because it's too fun. Most of you probably won't get to this because there's a lot of questions tonight. But the last question, if you do get to it, is tell the table about the worst date you've ever been on. You're not going to get to it, but
maybe later.
Maybe later.
All right, so I think we're
we're way over time.
we've got to get started.
Oh, we got to get started. Okay.
Do you want to get started?
Yeah. So here's the thing. Somebody at your table has an envelope. Maybe those people with an envelope can just show that, so you know. They only have one power. Okay.
I have it over there.
Don't let them take any other powers at the table. They're not your facilitator. They're not your camp counselor. They're definitely not the resident psychologist. They get to, well, he may be, but not tonight. Their one power is that they're going to read the questions once the table has completed each. So that's it. So they're going to read the questions. Now I'm going to tell you about the first question, because if I didn't, you'd all start talking about X, Y, or Z. But what I want us to do, like if you were here last year, as soon as Mark and I are done talking, I would love for the room to be perfectly silent, just for a minute, or let's say 20 seconds, right? So we want to get down to silence in the room, and then the first person who's going to speak at your table is going to talk about somebody that they love deeply that has died, right? This is what we're calling a generational ancestor. And you'll recognize that it's very similar to what we did with Death Over Dinner. Still a very important thing to do, but we've changed it a little bit, like somebody that you love deeply who has died. Now, this could be an animal. This could be somebody, if you're young and you haven't lost somebody very close to you. This could be, maybe you were a huge David Bowie fan, or insert celebrity that meant a lot to you. That's okay. Or you can pass on this one if you haven't had an experience with death. So don't eat your salads until everybody has completed this. And you'll know everybody has completed this at your table because you're attentive and you're deep listeners. But you also know it because you're going to light a candle for the person. They're about to bring matches out. We didn't give them to you to play with beforehand. Okay. There's matches on the table. So you'll light a candle, you'll say their name, and we're talking about a 30-second, 1 minute, who was this person? What did you love about them? And it's like a very short eulogy. Light a candle, then dig into your salads, and the table captains will read the first question. I'm not going to interrupt you to go on to the next question. They're going to ask the next question. If anything makes you feel comfortable, you can pass. I do invite you to be vulnerable. If you don't do it for yourself, somebody at your table might need to hear the thing that you're trying to edit from what you're saying. It really does help to speak from the heart. And then I'm going to interrupt you about when there's 10 minutes left, and we'll start appreciation in the round. You are all amazing. Thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Thank you, Michael.